Thank you, Julie, for talking with me today. I really appreciate it. For those of you who are my Jewish Learning fans, I'll tell you something I said to Julie just before we went live, which is my Jewish Learning has pulled my rabbi's chestnuts out of the fire 1,000 times over when I've needed information, succinctly and accurately and beautifully put. So thank you to you, and thank you to my Jewish Learning, and thank you to everyone for being here today. So the book is called The Beauty of What Remains. And let me share the backstory of why I wrote the book. We have to go back 3 years. 3 years ago, I gave a Kol Nidre sermon that turned out to be the most requested sermon. People from all over the world emailed asking for copies, and it kind of spread like wildfire. And it was a Kol Nidre sermon about the 10 things I had learned about life from being so intimate with so much death over the then 30 years of my rabbinate. So Wilshire Boulevard Temple is a very large synagogue, 2,400 families. And this is not rabbinic hyperbole, I had dealt with at least 1,000 families in walking them through this difficult process of the death of a loved one and grief and mourning and moving forward. And so I wrote this sermon with 10 points about what I had learned about life from death. 1 year later, to the day, we buried my father in Minneapolis after a 10-year journey through Alzheimer's. It was the morning of Kol Nidre. Now, why did I give that sermon on Kol Nidre? Because many of you know Kol Nidre is a kind of Jewish Day of the Dead. It's a day, it's an evening, and Yom Kippur is a day meant to mimic death in many ways so that we contemplate our deaths in order to change our lives. We wear white like a burial shroud. We fast because the dead neither eat nor drink. We begin the whole service by removing 3 Torahs from the Aron and chanting Kol Nidre. Those 3 Torahs represent the 3 judges in the Beit Din Shel Mala, in the heavenly tribunal, before which legend has it we will stand to make an account of our lives after we die. And many of us know that the word for ark, the Aron, where we keep the Torahs, is also the word for casket. So it's meant to evoke this feeling of standing before a heavenly tribunal, staring into our own empty casket. And it seemed an appropriate evening for a sermon about what death can teach us about life. And then, as I said, a year to the day, we buried my father. And through that process of my father's Alzheimer's and his death, and my grief in the aftermath of his death, I realized that, as I say in the prologue of the book, much of what I said in that sermon was just 1 degree shy of the deepest truth. And I wrote the book almost as an apology, or as an attempt to set the record straight, to bring you, the reader, with me down to that 1 degree deeper level of truth that death comes to teach us about life. And that's really why I wrote the book. And the book, I hope successfully, this was the tricky part in writing it, explores 2 different journeys. First of all, it's a field guide for people, a field guide through loss and through grief. What do we do? Why do we do it? How do we do it? When do we do it? How does it help? What's behind it all? That is interwoven or sewn together with the golden thread of the book, which is the narrative of my relationship with my father, and how Steve Leder, the rabbi, as a result of my father's disease and death, was finally able to become Steve Leder, the son. And these 2 narratives are woven together in the book in what I hope feels like a very organic and moving way. And so far, the feedback has been pretty good on that score. But that's the backstory.
Thank you. Would you say there's anything that has changed? Is there anything in that sermon that you gave that you would not have said, or that you would say differently now?
Absolutely. I'll give you 2 or 3 major readjustments that I made in my own thinking and feelings as a result of my father's death and my experience through that. The first is that I used to say to families before the service began, I'd sit with them in the back room at the chapel, and I would look them in the eye and I would say, Julie, the most honest and helpful thing I can say to you right now is it won't always hurt so much. Now I don't say that anymore. Now I will look you in the eye and say, Julie, the most honest and helpful thing I can tell you right now is it won't always hurt so often. There's a big difference. Because to say it won't always hurt so much, I think is to embrace a myth about grief. And I'm 60 years old, so everyone my age on this call, or my generation and yours, were raised under the umbrella of the thinking of Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, who created stages to death and dying and stages to grief. And to imply that grief has stages implies that it's a linear process. First you'll feel A, then you feel B, then you feel C, then you feel D, then you feel E, and then it's over. And that's not true. So I don't say it won't always hurt so much. I say it won't always hurt so often. And I say in the book that anyone thinks the shortest distance between 2 points is a straight line doesn't understand grief. Grief is much more like waves. So I'd like to talk, if it's okay with you, for a few minutes about that. Grief is the best metaphor I have been able to come up with, is that it's like waves. They come very close together and they're very large at first. And eventually they do come further apart. And sometimes you can have calm, beautiful seas for a week, a month, a year even. And then suddenly your back is turned and a massive rogue wave rises up and just takes you down. That's grief. Now, you know, I said earlier that I had to, I moved from Steve Leder, the rabbi, to Steve Leder, the son and the human being in this process. So to extend this wave metaphor, the old Steve Leder, the rabbi Steve Leder, whenever I saw any kind of wave coming at me, a wave of work, a wave of stress, a wave of opportunity, a wave of grief, a wave of loss, whatever it was, my default setting was, I'm going to plant my feet, chest out, face forward, and I'm going to hold my ground and stand up to this wave because I am stronger than this wave. And we all know what happens to people who do that sometimes. We end up, you know, thrown upside down against the rocks and gasping for air and lost and afraid. What my father's death and what that grief taught me, despite having seen thousands of people grieve before, is that the better way when that wave is coming at us is to lie down, let it wash over you, and float with it. Just float with it until you can stand up again. And maybe that's a minute, and maybe that's an hour, and maybe that's a day, and maybe that's a week. It doesn't matter. Just float with it. And that was a major shift in my thinking and in my counseling and in my teaching that I don't think I ever could have learned any other way. So that's the first thing. The second thing, and this is related to the fact that my father had Alzheimer's also, was it caused me to reassess and to achieve a deeper understanding of memory. You know, we have all these platitudes in Judaism about memory, right? We say things, you know, Zichrono livracha, may his memory be a blessing, or you'll always have her in your memories, right? It's all true. Memory is beautiful, but there's a duality to memory. Memory is beautiful, and it really, really hurts. It really hurts. In the book, I say it's like being caressed and spat on at the same time. That's memory. That's the truth of memory. And knowing that truth and understanding that you will always feel that duality is a very important insight and a kind of peacemaking with the truth, you know, of memory. And I guess I would say the final I mean, there were many, but I think the final thing I would say that I did not say in that sermon because I did not fully understand it. And it sounds so simple, and you would think a rabbi of 30 years would have known this. And maybe I also think the pandemic has come to teach us this, which is simply that no matter how many times we say, I love you, no matter how many times we hold the people we love and we're held by them, it's never enough. It's never enough. We need more of that and more of that and more of that in our life. And that was a lesson you would think I would have known. But it took grief to teach me that. It's part of the reason I called the book The Beauty of What Remains, because death strips away an awful lot and it leaves behind something very, very precious and beautiful that actually helps us lead more beautiful lives going forward. I don't know about you, but I have found during this pandemic and since the death of my father, I say I love you. Those words flow from my lips so much more easily and frequently than they did before. And I mean it. And that's a beautiful end result of loss. So those are some of the readjustments that I talk about in the book that I made internally as a result of experiencing the other side of death, not as a professional, but as a son.
It's not from an intellectual place, but from an emotional place, from an experiential place.
That's right. That's right.
So I want to go back for a moment to this idea of the ocean, the wave of grief, ocean of grief. That grief comes, as I'm sure the people who are on this call, and I know for myself, grief is not linear, right?
Correct.
Experience it's not structured, right? So my question is, if we look at our Jewish rituals that help us move through grief, they are very structured, right?
Mm-hmm.
We have the 7 days of Shiva, followed by the month of, the Shloshim, the month, followed by the year of mourning, and then marking once a year the Yortzeit. So how can we still work with Jewish mourning rituals while knowing that they're linear and our experiences may not be?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think of them more like vessels than rules, although obviously we have mitzvot that are to be observed. But I think of them more as tradition coming and saying, here is your vessel today to hold your sadness. It's yours. Use it as you wish. I said Kaddish for my father 3 times a day for 11 months. Some days, it literally, I felt, saved my life. It was the only thing that enabled me to walk out the door in the morning. Other days, less so. Other days, I didn't need it as much. I didn't feel it as much. So I think of it less as an obligation, as an always open door to a home to hold your feelings. And that's how I think of it. And I think that the fact that Kaddish, for example, is daily, it gives you this, it's prepared, it holds you whether there's a wave or not, right? It doesn't create the wave. It doesn't prevent the wave. It holds you during the wave if there's a wave that day. If not, then you're praising the greatness and the goodness and the glory of God. And, who could argue with that, right? So I don't see it so much that way. I do think for many people who fight against the random nature of grief, who want to push grief away, there's where I think it's very important and very helpful, where the tradition says, you need to stop now. You need to think about your loss. I know you don't want to. I know you don't think you need to, but let's trust in a 2,000-year-old wise tradition and lean on it a little bit. Have some faith. So that's how I see it. I think that's my general orientation to Judaism in general. I see it as an open door, not as a prison.
You also bring up the current the current lives that we're all living, given given the pandemic. And I was thinking that many people, of course, are grieving for the loss of life of a close relative, either from COVID or from any other cause. And
Yes.
then on top of that, we have kind of a communal grieving process
Yes.
for a life that we used to have, that we no longer
Yes.
have, and that we don't know if we'll get back. And I wondered if you could talk to that parallel and how we can use the tools, the things that we learn from death for that communal
Yes.
grieving process.
Yes. It's a great question, and I've thought a lot about it. I obviously didn't plan for this book to land in the middle of the worst pandemic in 100 years, but it did. And I'm glad it did, because all of us are suffering with so much loss right now. Yes, it may be the loss of the life of a loved one or a friend's loved one, but let's think about the other losses we are all carrying in our hearts. We've lost our freedom. We've lost our sense of invulnerability. I mean, is there anything more difficult than feeling vulnerable? And we are all so vulnerable. And we realize not only are we individually vulnerable, I think we have all been awakened to the fact that as a species, we are vulnerable. And that's frightening. That is a terrible loss of a sense of invulnerability. We've lost jobs. We've lost money. We've lost the right for our kids to be in school, which we all know is where they belong. And related to the point I made earlier, we've lost the most fundamental beauty of being human, which is to touch and be touched by people we love. I have an 87-year-old mother in Minneapolis. I haven't hugged my mother in a year. So we're all dealing with so much loss. And where I think the fundamentals of loss of grief, where they apply, I think first of all, similarly, when you feel this loss, let's recognize it as grief, and let's lie down and let's let it wash over us a little bit. Let's be charitable and kind to ourselves, and accept that we're mourning, and cut ourselves some slack. And the other thing I would say, Julie, that is so important is that we reach out. The Talmud says the prisoner cannot free himself. That's such a powerful thought. The prisoner cannot free himself. No one endures suffering better alone. And we all feel so isolated. We have to find a way to reach out. I'll tell you a very interesting little psychological study that I looked at for my previous book. My previous book was about pain and the lessons we learned from pain, physical and emotional. So there was a study that was done where they took a group of college kids, they put them alone in a room with a bucket of ice water, and they asked them to stick their feet in the ice water and keep them in there for as long as they could stand the pain. Then they ran the same experiment with the same subjects with another person sitting in the room with them. And every subject was able to keep his or her feet in the ice water longer. They could endure pain longer because they weren't alone. No one suffers better alone. So we have to reach out. And when you reach out, yeah, you will be disappointed by a few people. But there will be others who will reach back and help lift us from our suffering. And that is so, so important. So it's a time to really double down on our relationships and to pierce that isolation and to be kind to ourselves and treat ourselves as mourners, because we are mourners. There's no two ways about that.
And how have your modes of support shifted? So like when you talked about your mom and giving her a hug or not giving her a hug, I mean, it's very painful. I know a lot of us are experiencing that pain. I remember from my mother's funeral, the thing that felt the most supportive was the moment someone came over and placed a jacket on my back because apparently I was shivering.
Yes.
And the physical touch. So what has come to, I don't want to say replace it, but how have you shifted your own supportive practices?
Yeah. Well, as I said earlier, first of all, I say I love you a lot more now. And I mean it. I really mean it. I'm saying to my friends, I really love you. I want you to know that. And I didn't used to be that way. It went unsaid. I think I love you are three of the most powerful words any human being can utter. So I think we need to tell people we love them. Zoom is an inadequate form, but it's far better than nothing. I Zoom with my siblings. I Zoom with my friends. Obviously, I Zoom with colleagues. You know, we're running a big temple virtually, essentially. I'm pretty damn tired of it, to be honest, but it's a lot better than nothing. And then I think it comes to doubling down on that small group of people with whom you do have physical contact. Now, I know for some that's almost no one, but let's appreciate this opportunity. This is also part of the beauty of what remains. When you take things away, you often find something beautiful, like finding a sculpture within a block of marble. That sculpture, that beauty was always there, but a lot had to be removed in order for it to emerge. Well, I'm having dinner every night with our 31-year-old son. And 3 or 4 nights a week, his girlfriend's here too. We have gotten to know this woman better in 10 months than we would have in 10 years under normal circumstances. And we are a tighter family. We cook together, we eat together, we do the dishes together. I'm sorry to say that's not how it used to be, right? We were frenetic. There was a centrifuge of life that was spinning us apart. So I think it's really now a question of doubling down on the people you can have contact with and being in constant or frequent contact with those you can't. I know none of this is rocket science, but it really does help. And I think the most important thing, a very important component of this, is hope. Hope is so important. In our lowest moments, it's hard not to feel like this is endless, but almost nothing is endless. It is going to end. The bottom has not fallen out of the world, even when it feels like it. You know, just to give you an example back from death, Julie, I have helped families bury children in caskets the size of a shoebox. And 5 years later, I see them at the movies laughing and eating popcorn, as they should be, as they should be. It's not that their hearts aren't broken. It's not that they've forgotten. It's not that they're in denial. It's just that human beings have an amazing capacity to walk back out into the light, right? We walk through the valley of the shadow of death. We don't stay there forever. And I would also remind, if I could just riff on the 23rd Psalm for a moment, think about this metaphor of a shadow for a moment. If you think deeply about a shadow, and I think we're all under a dark shadow right now, no matter how long or how dark a shadow is, it's actually proof of light. It's actually proof that there's a light still shining. You cannot have a shadow unless the sun is still shining. It's obstructed. It's obstructed by a virus. It's obstructed by loss. It's obstructed by grief. But that is all a reflection of the fact that life is still there ahead of us waiting for us. And we just have to keep going. And I always try to remember this beautiful Yiddish expression, which in English, don't ask me for the Yiddish because my Yiddish isn't great, which in English is, when you must, you can. When you must, you can. And I have seen that countless times in my rabbinate and in my own life. So let's keep going with hope and reach out to the people we love and say, I love you often. And we're going to get through it.
May it be so. Thank you for that, that hope. I want to shift gears for a second. I'll also post a link to your book in the chat box so that folks can easily find it if they want to purchase it.
It's finally in stock again, thank goodness. Amazon, they ran out. Now they've got books again. So
yeah, toilet paper and book.
You can't fight with Amazon. It's impossible. It's just
I'm glad it's back in stock.
Yeah.
So I was wondering if you could speak to some Jewish conceptions of the afterlife or of the soul living outside of the body. And then the other prong of this question is, do you still feel the presence of your father.
Yeah.
Has your relationship with your father changed since
Yes.
his death?
Yes.
So thank you.
Well, let's start with the latter. My relationship with my father is in many ways more beautiful now than it was when he was alive. Those of you who will read the book will understand why I'm saying that. He was a very complicated, harsh, crude, even, um, and effusive and amazing man. But it was not easy to be his son. I find it easier to be his son in death in many cases than it was in life. It has rounded the sharp edges and allowed more of the beautiful part of him to emerge. And it emerges almost every day. First of all, I think about him every time I talk about the book with anyone. He comes to me almost every day to make me laugh. Every time I leave a room and forget to turn off the light and I go back and turn off the light, that's my dad, because he was extraordinarily frugal, and that's an understatement. My dad actually reused his dental floss because he thought it was still a perfectly good piece, if that gives you any idea of what we're talking about. So every time I go back to turn off a light, it's my dad. He makes me laugh most days. Many times I'm observing a person or a situation, and he comes to me with exactly the right Yiddish word to summarize the entire situation, and makes me laugh. He humbles me, reminds me to, keep my head down. So I have a beautiful relationship with my dad now. And yes, it has what I was saying before about the duality of memory, and sometimes it includes remembering the harsh and difficult things. It's both. In terms of Jewish views of the afterlife, I mean, there are a few great books about it, but like most questions related to Judaism, because it's a relatively a 3,000-year-old tradition, there are lots of answers to that question. There's everything from literal resurrection. I mean, if Ezekiel's vision in the Valley of Dry Bones isn't resurrection, I don't know what is. These bones rise up and take on flesh, right? And Julie, because you're a scholar, there in the Talmud, there's a very detailed working out of what the afterlife looks like and what the world to come looks like. And we're going to all be reborn and roll in tunnels under the ground to Jerusalem and live in the Yeshiva Shalmala forever. I mean, there's all kinds of intricate imaginings about the afterlife. And then, of course, after the Enlightenment, you have rationalists and pragmatists who say, when you die, that's it. And others, this is what I believe now, which I think is a fair question. What do I believe? I have literally looked and seen 1,000 dead bodies. Anyone who looks at a dead body knows that is not the person we knew and loved. That is an empty vessel. That is a cocoon and the butterfly has flown. That's how I look at it. That's how I talk to children about body and soul, cocoon and butterfly. I don't care if you call it a soul. I don't care if you call it an essence, an energy, a spirit. It doesn't matter to me what word people want to use. Use whatever word makes sense to you. But it is so clear to me there's so much more to us than our corporeal beings. And then I have heard just too many stories and had too many encounters of my own to dismiss the idea that we're still connected somehow to the soul of the people we love who have died. I'll give you one small example. Not to go on too long about my difficult childhood, but it was. There were 5 kids, and my mom and dad, and they had 5 kids before they were 30. They were clueless about what it meant to be parents. And my dad kind of ruled the house through fear. However, every once in a while, we would go on a Sunday drive in the station wagon, all 7 of us. My dad would drive, and he would sing songs to us. And the song he sang most of all was "You Are My Sunshine." And I remember feeling as a little boy when my dad was, I'm sorry. I remember feeling when I was a little boy in that station wagon, when my dad was singing that song, that he really loved us. Like I knew he really loved us. when I was working on the book, I was writing the 4th chapter of the book, and I have a sister with a house in Palm Springs, and it was the summer, so it was empty. She was back in Minnesota. So I spent all day for a month, every day, in this dark, cold house in the desert working on this chapter. And then when the sun went down and it was cool enough, meaning it was maybe 90, I would go outside for a walk. And one night I walked around a golf course that my dad and I had walked around 100 times because my parents used to have a condo in Palm Springs. And I was thinking about my dad. And as I was walking and thinking about my dad, I looked up and there was one of the houses on the golf course with a big wooden sign on the porch with the words, "To you are my sunshine," on it. And I just, fell apart. Now, I know a psychiatrist might say to me, well, that was just a projection. That wasn't your dad. That was a projection. That sign was always there. To which I say, I don't care. To me, the projection is real. To me, walking back in and turning off the lights is my dad. Whether that's a projection or not, I don't care. To me, it's real. And to me, that is an afterlife. And to me, that is a big part of the beauty that remains. And that's my feeling about the afterlife. And I do talk about this more in depth in the book, obviously, but that's sort of the medium length answer to your question.
Very beautiful. Thank you for sharing that intimate story with us. I think I'll ask one more question. And in the meantime, if folks who are here with us have any questions they want to ask, you can put that in the chat. And if Rabbi Leder has time, we can get to a couple of those.
Yeah, of course.
So you talk about in your book, death and mortality being teachers for how to live our lives. And I was really struck by what you write at the end of the chapter on eulogies. You say, we are each writing our own eulogies every day with the pen of our lives.
Yeah.
What do you mean by that?
Well, everyone thinks the rabbi writes their eulogy or the friend writes their eulogy, and it's not true. We assemble a eulogy made out of the components of the life the person lived. And so we really are writing our own eulogies with, as I said, the pen of our lives. And one of the most beautiful parts of my being a rabbi is sitting with family after family after family to talk about their loved one who has died. Now, why is it beautiful? For many reasons. First of all, everyone's life is interesting. Everyone. No one has a boring life. Everyone has an interesting story. And I'm telling you that I've heard 1,000 of them, literally. Everyone's life is interesting if you ask the right questions. The other thing that's been beautiful for me about what clergy call intake meetings is I have been privy to the highest level graduate course in what really remains after we die in the hearts of the people we loved. Because when I sit with these families, these adult children tell me exactly that. What do you remember about your dad? And out it comes. What was it like to be with him when you were a little girl? How did you feel holding your mom's hand? Why? Where is she in you? What is there in you, Julie, that you point to and say, oh, that's my mom. Right? And so you begin to learn what matters and what doesn't matter in people's lives if what your mission is to be remembered with love, And it's, by the way, if I had to give you some generalization that might be helpful, it's never the big things. Never. When I sit down with families to talk about their loved one, the kids don't start out with, well, he was the CEO of blah, 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 blah. No, that's not it. They talk about things like, I remember when I was 5 years old and I got a nickel for my allowance and I went to the candy store with my mom and I couldn't decide if I should use the nickel for the caramel stick or the caramel corn. And my mom said, you know what? Let's get both. That's what people remember. You know, my dad, he had this big job, or he was a surgeon and he saved people's lives. But what I remember about my dad is we would get up early in the morning before I had to go to school, and we'd go out in the garage and work on the cage we made for my pet salamander, Sally the salamander, whatever it is. Those are the things. It's these small, tiny, beautiful things. They are emblematic of a person's life. And you know, a simple way to remember this is to just walk through a cemetery. I spent a lot of time in cemeteries, obviously, and especially since COVID. And I'm always struck by the almost total uniformity of inscriptions on headstones in cemeteries. Every person is unique. Every person leads a unique life. But when you have to distill a person's life down to 15 characters per line and 4 lines per headstone, you are engaged in a very instructive form of essentialism, right? And what do all these headstones say? They all say almost exactly the same thing. Loving wife, mother, grandmother, friend. Loving husband, father, grandfather, friend. That's it. No resume, no net worth, not your children's GPA, not your address, none of it. It all comes down to the quality and depth of a tiny handful of relationships that really matter. And do any of us really have more than a tiny handful of people who really matter? No. Despite how we live our lives, right? We all live our lives somehow. This is a great COVID lesson too. We all live as if a busy life is the same thing as a meaningful life, because we're seduced to do that by our culture. But it isn't true. Just walk through the cemetery and you will see that that's not true. A busy life is not the same thing as a meaningful life. And death comes to wake us up to that fact, ideally, and change us, change the way we choose to live. And that's the beauty of it. That's why it's a great teacher. That's why it may be the only teacher.
That's what I was going to ask. Does it take death to
Yes.
learn a lesson? I mean, Joan comments, I wish people could have these intake meetings when sharing when we're all still alive.
Yeah, it does. Unfortunately, it does. Now, there are some things you can do. Like for Shabbat, every Friday night around our table, we appreciate each other. This is what I appreciated about you this week. This is what I appreciated about you this week. We do it. You can build it in, but it's not the same. You know, Kafka said the meaning of life is that it ends. It's so simple, but it's really true. And, you know, I have to say, I don't think there's any greater teacher than death. I really don't. Let me ask you a question. Do you think if this virus lacked the lethality that it has, right? If it was the flu, do you think for a moment we would be in this global pause and reassessment of life on our planet? Not for a minute. We'd be running around on the freeway and wearing uncomfortable clothes and running to meetings with people we just could have Zoomed with. You know, there's something about death that only death has the power to wake us up to life. Wallace Stevens, the poet, said, I'm paraphrasing, the beauty of a flower is that it fades. You know, that's so true. That's why we're unmoved by plastic flowers, by the way. Nobody likes plastic flowers because they're not real. Only death makes life real.
Wow, thank you. This has all been very powerful. I think there's maybe one more question
Let's do one more.
About Judaism and dementia and Alzheimer's and how to navigate the loss of memory.
Well, the truth, and I wish I knew less about this than I do. My dad was diagnosed at 75 and died at 85. I can tell you some of the things that I learned that helped. First of all, I think it's very fair and even helpful to recognize, and important to recognize, that people with diseases like dementia and Alzheimer's, they die twice. My father died twice. He died when his brain was no longer the brain of the man I knew, when he was really a different person. And that was a death. And then he died when his body died. So I think we have to just be honest with ourselves and our feelings, that these people die twice. And it's painful both times. The first death, people sometimes say to me, I'm so shocked at how sad I am because I lost my dad 5 years ago when he no longer knew who I was, but I'm so sad today. Well, yes, because there are two deaths. That's the first thing. The second thing, which is simple advice I think anyone would give, is that when you're dealing with someone with dementia, don't try to push the river upstream. Go with them on their journey. If when I visited my dad, if he was in 1937 with his dog Foxy, I was right there with him in 1937 with his dog Foxy. If he thought I was his brother, I was his brother. If he thought I was his grandson, I was his grandson. Don't try to push the river upstream. Just go with it, right? And the last thing I would say is that after my father lost the ability to speak, he lived for another 1.5 years or so. And during that 1.5 years, my father and I learned a new language, which was the language of touch. I would sit in the nursing home with him in his wheelchair, and I would just hold his hand for hours and say nothing. And it was beautiful. And I hadn't held my father's hand since I was a small boy. So I would say to people who have loved ones suffering from these diseases, do not underestimate the power of touch. Even in your case, Julie, when someone just put a jacket over your shivering shoulders, that's what you remember. That. The power of another person just holding you. So learn that new language with your loved one. I would give him a scalp massage, and he would sigh. It was like it lifted him from his sorrows, and it was beautiful. And there's a kind of intimacy that's both beautiful and painful. Every boy, when he's young and he watches his father shave in the morning in the mirror, it's amazing. It's the most manly thing you ever see as a boy, is your father, shaving in the mirror. And never did I ever think that someday I would be shaving my father. And yes, that was heartbreaking, but it was also so intimate and so beautiful that I could take care of him in some way, in his vulnerability. And so I would urge people to just embrace that beauty that remains and embrace the power of touch, and to remember, it's another one of my father's Yiddish sayings, abyssal is a plot. It had to do with saving money, of course, which everything did, but it means a little is a lot. A little is a lot. And that's a good way to live going through the life of a loved one who's suffering from Alzheimer's or dementia, is that a little is a lot. And that's what I learned.
Is there anything else you'd like to share with us before we wrap up? Anything that we didn't cover that you want folks to know about the book?
There's a lot in the book. I think one of the things we didn't cover that I hope people will find in the book is you talked about eulogies in the pen of our lives, is I do in a chapter in the book talk about the importance of an ethical will, which is something Jews have been writing since the 11th century in Germany, Italy, and France. The idea of bequeathing not only your material goods and wealth to your children or your loved ones, if you don't have children, but also creating a parallel document called an ethical will that bequeaths your values and ideals to your loved ones in a very clear way. And I think my next book is going to be just a short little guide to help people create their own ethical wills, because I think it's such a beautiful and important exercise. So I would just urge people to kind of, find that chapter, because it's another way of making sure the people we love have some beauty that will remain. I mean, that's my hope. And I want to just close by thanking you, Julie. You were so open when I asked about the possibility of having a conversation like this, and I thank you for it. And I again want to thank My Jewish Learning, because I don't know if you realize what an important resource it is, not only for Jews but for non-Jews as well. So I really applaud what you're doing, and I want to thank everyone for sharing this time with us.